For those of you that are new here, I actually have two motorcycles. I got a 2007 Suzuki M109R and I also have a 2013 V-Rod Muscle. But in this video, I want to talk about why the M109R is torn down, which is pretty much maintenance. And I want to go over how this project has pretty much taken me a lot longer than it should have. Plus, you know, with me traveling for Indian and making content, this project has pretty much just gotten behind. And it started out as just simple maintenance, but I want to go over where I am in this, I guess, project and the things that I've broken and what the ultimate plans are. So obviously the forks were a huge issue, and I can actually luckily tell you guys that the forks are actually completely redone and back on the bike. We actually got the seals replaced, and the guy that actually replaced the seals for me, I took them off and put them back on myself. That actually saved me $100 without him having to do that labor. He actually cleaned the forks up for me, and they were looking brand spanking new when he brought them back to me, so much thanks there. The brakes. So here's the funny thing about the brakes. So again, the fork seals, when my forks were actually leaking, not on this side but the other side, it actually leaked all of its fork seal oil all over the calipers, and I was super lazy. I was completely lazy over time and just didn't handle that, and it resulted in me having to completely rebuild the entire caliper on both sides. So basically these calipers have been completely rebuilt from the piston rings, the piston seals, and everything that goes inside of that caliper except the actual pistons for themselves. So I had to actually take these apart and clean them. And the crazy part is, when I was putting this back together, I accidentally over torqued one of these bolts that actually hold the brake pad in, and it ended up snapping that. So that caliper technically needs to be replaced because I over torqued the bolt. But on this side, we're actually good. But what I also realized is when I was doing the rear brakes also were redone. And the problem with the rear brakes was, since I was changing the fronts, I changed the rear pads as well. I actually found that I had rust in my brake lines, or old brake fluid. It ended up turning into rust with moisture. So what I ended up doing, I ended up taking the rear brake off, so there's no rear brake line. And the only reason the fronts are still on here is because I ended up changing the master cylinder. I actually changed the seals in the master cylinder, cleaned it out as well. So this brake line is actually going to have to come off, even though the front brakes are fully functional. They've been redone. I can technically ride the bike with these brakes. But since I'm changing the rear brakes out, the brake line, I bought the front brake line as well. So the bike is going to get steel braided lines. So again, the whole reason the calipers, technically the calipers needed to be rebuilt anyway. They weren't leaking, but since I already took everything apart, they were really dirty. They really just needed to be cleaned since I was already there. But another thing involving the brakes was my rear rotor. So a lot of you are new here. Again, this rear rotor that was previously on the bike, it was very shaky. So this was my rear rotor. That's the play that rotor had. And rotors are okay to have a little bit of play, but when it was on the bike, it had a lot of play, which was too much. And plus the rotor had got to the point where it was actually thinner than what the spec allowed. So I replaced it. And then we got the valves. So I did my valve checks. First time doing it, basically I went in and used a filler gauge to determine whether or not the clearances were in spec. And luckily, both the front and rear cylinder, well, this is the rear, this is the front, both cylinders were actually still in spec. Granted, they were at the bottom end of the spec. So let's say you had a 0.08 for the bottom end of the spec, and the top was 0.0125. I was at 0.08 for those specific specs. So the 109 is actually in spec as far as that goes. So this here is my rear brake reservoir, and this is my rear master cylinder, which I've taken apart, completely gutted it, all the seals, cleaned it with wire brushes and purple power, and I got to recoat it in brake fluid. But this piece right here actually broke, and as you can see, all the corrosion inside of it. Yeah, so this is my entire rear brake setup outside of the caliper and the brake line. So again, the bike is going to have an entirely new brake system, both front and back. So it's gonna be absolute ridiculous when it's done. Next up, we got motor mounts. So these are the mounts that hold the motor on the bike. This is the old mount. Absolutely ridiculous. This is also one of the old mounts. The new ones are already on, but yeah, it was not necessarily a hard job, but it was a job to get those out, and I'm actually still not done putting it back together. But where I made a mistake was I completely drained the radiator, completely drained it and refilled it back up, and come to find out, when it was time to actually take the motor mounts out, I couldn't get the motor mounts out without draining the radiator. So I wasted radiator fluid. Brand new radiator fluid. I should have taken the motor mounts out and replaced those and then replaced the radiator fluid. So that was a mistake on my part. And outside of that, there's still various seals and things like the exhaust bolts that I somewhat stripped trying to get the exhaust off. I bought replacement pieces for that because it took me a little bit to get those off, and I didn't want to put a almost stripped bolt back on the exhaust, especially because those bolts take a lot of heat and they're a little bit difficult to get off, especially after they've been on for a while. So I bought more bolts. And then there's my entire airbox system, which has been sitting over here for a few weeks. I completely took it apart, cleaned it, let it sit out, and it's gonna allow the engine to breathe better. But at the same time, it's been sent over here to the point now where it's just covered in pollen. So I'm gonna have to clean this again, technically, before I put it back on the bike. But either way, it's a lot better than what it was. But the good news in all of this is the fact that the 109 is not only gonna ride better, but it's gonna be set for another 15,000 miles, because I am gonna have to take the valve covers off again, because at this point, being that they're on the bottom end of the spec, next time I check these at the specified interval, they're gonna be out of spec. So that means I'm gonna have to actually take the cams out. And this doesn't even include the other stuff that I have to do to the bike and that I've already done, because I've already changed the clutches, I've changed the clutch plates, and I also changed the clutch cable, and then I gotta refill the radiator, and then I have to change the finer gear oil, and I have to change the regular oil in the motor. There's a lot to do, but this is where the 9's at, and like I said, I'm trying to get it back because luckily I still have the V-Rod to ride, but I'm ready to ride the 109 because I miss riding it. But yeah, that's the update on the 109. I haven't forgotten about it, although I've been traveling and riding 116s across the country, but I'm gonna try to get this done very soon because I'm ready to ride this bike again. But right now I'm actually about to go ride on the V-Rod because I have to go to the store. So yeah, if you haven't subscribed already, definitely hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. And yeah, if you're already subscribed, thanks for your support as always, and hitting that thumbs up button. See y'all in the next one.